Good afternoon. My name is Leah Miller, and I'm the Associate Director at the JFNA Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care. We're really pleased to have you here with us today. This is our third webinar in our virtual training workshop series, looking ahead to the future of person-centered trauma-informed care for older adults and family caregivers, a conversation with ACL. So we use some jargon in here. First, you see the word PCTI. I mean, we are in Washington. You see the word PCTI, and that's a holistic approach to service provision that promotes dignity, strength, empowerment of trauma victims by incorporating knowledge about the role of trauma victims into agencies, programs, policies, and procedures. And that definition was by our own Dr. Bedney, who's on the webinar right now, and Michael Eisinger. And given the times that we're in and the challenges that are faced by our clients, this care has never been more important. So on this call today, we're also going to speak with the Administration for Community Living. That's what ACL stands for. It's part of the Department of Health and Human Services. And you'll hear from Greg how it fits into the bigger picture. And this is really a unique opportunity that we're giving you to engage with our federal program officer at the Administration for Community Living, who oversees our grant program, and to hear about how our grant came to be, and also ACL's vision for person-centered trauma-informed care. So during this webinar, you're going to learn why a person-centered trauma-informed care is important to the Administration for Community Living, how ACL has invested in person-centered trauma-informed care, how ACL supports the capacity of the Aging Service Network to provide person-centered trauma-informed care, ACL's vision for the future and trauma and aging, as well as how ACL can help advance that agenda. So before we get started, there's a few housekeeping. We've decided to mute the lines and only show those who are going to be speaking on the webinar because we are expecting over 100 participants. And so it's just easier to control the noise and background. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the entire webinar. We want to hear from you. And Greg is more than happy to answer your questions. So you'll see at the bottom of your screen is a Q&A box. And that's where you're going to type your questions, and we'll read all the questions at the end of the call, and Greg is planning to stay on to answer those questions. Also, the webinar is being recorded, and we will share the PowerPoint and recording after the webinar is over. And at the end of this webinar, we'll also give you a participation code, and that's specifically for the Delta and Echo subgrantees to prove participation. So with that, it's my honor to introduce and welcome to Stacy Barber, who is going to introduce today's speaker, Greg Link. So Stacy is our brand new co-chair of JFNA's National Holocaust Survivor Initiative. We are so lucky to have her because not only is she on the board of directors for one of our subgrantees, Self Help, and for another of our subgrantees, UJA Federation of New York, but we're glad to welcome her to join us to see things from a national perspective as well. Stacy? Stacy, I'm sorry that we can't hear you.
I'm muted. Okay, I apologize. I'll start over. Thank you, Leah. I'm really quite honored to be here in Holocaust Survivor Initiative. All of you on this call today who are doing this sacred work day out, national pandemic, and we're just so grateful. I'm delighted to introduce Greg Link, who I told is the best on account of his experience.
Greg, it looks like you're having technical difficulties. Well, you can know that we are really honored that you're here with us today, and we're really glad to have you presenting with us. So, Greg?
Okay, thank you all so much, and thank you, Stacy, for that introduction.
Sorry, I vanished.
Oh, okay.
No, I'm sorry that I vanished. Can you hear me? No.
Yep, sort of.
Oh, okay. I don't know. Well, we're just very fortunate to have you. I'm sorry, my connection apparently is very unstable here on Long Island. Too many people on the internet, I think, and not in my household today. So I apologize for that. But we're very fortunate to have you and your compassion and guidance overseeing the federal grant. So I think that people know your background, but just quite briefly, your formal title is Director of the Office of Supportive and Caregiver Services with the Administration for Community Living, U.S. Administration on Aging, which oversees programs funded under the Older Americans Act, including Title IIIB, in-home supportive services, Title IIIE National Family Caregiver Support Program, as well as the ACL's Alzheimer's disease programs, and of course the federal grant that we're talking about called Advancing Person-Centered Trauma-Informed Supportive Services for Holocaust Survivors. You have lots of other qualifications. I'm sure that everybody will go look them up after, but I just figure I'll pass it on to you right now. Thank you very much, and I apologize again for the unstable broadcast.
No worries, and thank you, Stacy. It is really great to be here with everyone this afternoon. I think this might be the fourth training workshop that I've had the privilege of being a part of as part of this grant that the JFNA has from ACL. And I've thoroughly enjoyed every one of these meetings, although they were in person, and the energy is always so incredible to be in the room with all of you. This works just as well, and I'm just really pleased to be here. If you could move to the next slide, please. So I don't know who's on. I know that it's all of the sub-grantees to the Jewish Federations of North America, and I know that I've had the opportunity and the privilege to speak with many of you before. But for those of you who may be relatively new as a sub-grantee or may be new to your organization in your work with this and may have not had a chance to talk with me before. What I want to do today is just kind of give everyone a brief overview of ACL, who we are, kind of where we sit within the federal government, because I think it's important to have that context as a way of grounding the work that we do and that we're going to be doing. I also want to talk a little bit about why person-centered trauma-informed care is so important and how it actually got on the radar screen of ACL. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the latest developments that I think are kind of exciting as a result of the work that you all have been engaged in. And then we'll look ahead a little bit to the future. And then probably my favorite part is just getting to talk with you and hear what you have to say and the questions that you have. So with that, if we can go to the next slide, please. So as Leah mentioned, I'm with the Administration for Community Living, and ACL is a relatively new, what's called an operating division within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Operating divisions are, you hear of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, you hear of the FDA, you hear of CMS. Those are operating divisions. They're all parts that make up the broader whole of the Department of Health and Human Services. And ACL is another one of those operating divisions. We happen to be the smallest one in the Department of Health and Human Services, but I think we're the most mighty. And we certainly do work with a wonderful network of state and community-based partners to help improve the lives of older people and people with disabilities. ACL was actually created in 2012. And it brought together initially the first three organizations that you see on this slide. The U.S. Administration on Aging, which has been around since 1965, when the Older Americans Act was passed. And then it brought together also the Administration on Disability and the Administration for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And then over the course of 3 successive years, through a couple of acts of Congress and a couple of appropriations bills, ACL gradually grew to include the Independent Living Administration, the Paralysis Resource Center, the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research, or NIDLR, as we call it. They actually moved over from the Department of Education, as well as the WIOA, the Workforce Innovation Programs, and the Traumatic Brain Injury Programs that were actually part of HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration. So ACL really is this nice conglomeration and a wonderful grouping of agencies and programs, all with a mission to help improve the lives of older adults, people with disabilities, and their family caregivers. And we really, as ACL, we work with across these different program and population areas to develop policies and improve supports for people, for seniors and people with disabilities of all ages. So if you can go to the next slide, please. Now, some of you who I've had the opportunity to speak to before have seen this slide because, and I think it's important because to understand sort of the breadth of programming that ACL administers and to understand how your work fits into the broader vision of ACL and our legislative mandate and mission. So ACL being composed of a number of different smaller groups from the past, we also operate and implement a number of authorizing programs and statutes. And I've put the Older Americans Act at the top and bolded it in red because that's the program under which all of your work in this grant is happening, out of the Older Americans Act. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. But ACL and my office in particular also administers our programs under the Public Health Services Act. We have our Alzheimer's disease programs and the Lifespan Respite Care program. And then other parts of ACL implement the Help America Vote Act, the WIOA programs, and other programs like the SHIPS, the Paralysis Resource Center, the Traumatic Brain Injury programs, and the like. But it's the Older Americans Act that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about because that was, the Older Americans Act, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, was passed in 1965. It was part of President Johnson's Great Society programs, and it occurred at the same time or right around the same time that Medicare was passed, and then Medicare and Medicaid came into being. And so in 1965, we saw this huge focus on the needs of older adults, frail older adults, low-income individuals, healthcare, and the like. And the Older Americans Act programs have been an integral part of our national fabric and our way of how we think about and support frail older adults. If we can go on to the next slide. So how did ACL get to this place with person-centered trauma-informed care? And you heard Leah mention a few minutes ago this definition of PCTI, and that definition is actually the one that became refined and fine-tuned over the course of JFNA's work on this grant. When ACL initially funded or developed the first funding opportunity announcement for this work back in 2015, we were looking for person-centered approaches to trauma-informed care. And the person-centeredness came from ACL's broad focus on placing the individual or the consumer or the user of services or the family at the center of the system, and everything else wraps around them and focuses on their needs specifically. And so we also saw the opportunity posed by this to begin looking at trauma in aging. Something that up until the work that the JFNA and you all have been doing is something that's been relatively focused on relatively little in our work. We see a lot of work in trauma in younger adult populations, in domestic violence, sexual abuse, child abuse, things of that nature. But when we look at trauma-informed care and trauma-informed supportive services, there was relatively little work in the aging space. And so AOA at the time and ACL really saw this as an opportunity to begin just sort of plowing new ground in an area that needed to be developed, because we know from the work and we know from the research that trauma and histories of trauma is pervasive. And any of you that have been involved with this work, have been involved with Leah and Shelley and the team there at JFNA, know that trauma is pervasive. It's estimated that anywhere from 70 to 90% of older adults have histories of trauma. And the impacts of this trauma can be significant. Oftentimes, the lasting impacts of trauma result in increased disease risk. If that trauma occurs at a younger age, as is the case with Holocaust survivors, oftentimes we can see impaired development. Whether it's physical development, emotional or cognitive development, what have you, the impacts of trauma can very much affect how we develop. But it also can put up barriers to how we receive and accept interventions and supports. Because oftentimes, if you've had a history of trauma, the very thing that that may have caused your trauma could actually be triggered again by interactions with other people for whatever reason. We also know that trauma can impact multiple generations. And oftentimes we see that the individual the older adult who's had a history of trauma can oftentimes pass on some of the physical and emotional manifestations of trauma to second generations, who oftentimes become family caregivers. And these people can also manifest some very similar symptoms to the person who initially suffered the trauma. And these are some of the things that we've learned over the course of this first project that we're looking to advance and move forward. And so we're trying to begin focusing a bit on a multi-generational approach to how we address and treat and work with trauma. So can we go on to the next slide, please? So how did ACL get involved in this work? Now, some of you have also heard this story before, and some of you were around and had actually interacted with the previous administration that had a very, very focused effort on reaching out to the Holocaust survivor community. In 2013, the White House launched an initiative that focused specifically on health and social service needs of Holocaust survivors. And one aspect of that initiative was the appointment of a special envoy to the Holocaust survivor community who happened to reside in ACL. And she traveled around the country for a year, and indeed around the world in many cases, meeting with Holocaust survivors, with the programs that serve Holocaust survivors, and really got to understand the needs and the situations impacting the ability of survivors to be able to benefit fully from a range of services and supports. And so it was after this work, and as the result of a special appropriation from Congress in 2015 to the Older Americans Act appropriation. And so that's why a couple of slides ago I had highlighted the Older Americans Act in red, because that's why it's so significant, is because this work is authorized under the Older Americans Act. Congress designated $2.5 million specifically to help provide supportive services for aging Holocaust survivors living in the US. And that was the exact word out of the appropriations language that directed AOA and ACL at the time to develop a program to provide services and supports to survivors. And so with this mandate, I began thinking about how do we make the most use of these limited funds and fill a real need. And so in working with other parts of the Department of Health and Human Services, specifically the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, who had just recently published a primer on trauma-informed supportive services, we realized that we had an opportunity to really begin to develop an area and a demonstration around serving older adult populations with histories of trauma. And we knew that Holocaust survivors were a population group with a significant history of trauma and could ultimately very much benefit from this type of approach. And so we recognize that traumatic events can impact anyone at any time across the life course, but that as you get into older age, it becomes increasingly important to be able to meet those needs in a trauma-informed way. Keeping in line with AOA's very long history of supporting innovations in the field of aging, we also saw it as an opportunity to advance the broader aging network's capacity to become trauma-informed while having an immediate impact and benefit for the Holocaust survivors who so desperately need it today. So if we can go on to the next slide. So We've made a lot of progress to date, and one of the things, as a federal program officer, somebody who has managed many grant programs in my federal career, one of the exciting things is to be able to see the growth and the progress that comes out of managing a grant program. You know, the federal government, really any entity, makes a grant to an organization or to an entity for the purposes of seeing change or creating change or advancing the ball, testing new ideas. That's what grants are about. It's about growing and changing and finding benefit in new ways of doing things. And so we began in 2015, and really for the first 3 years of this work with an appropriation of $2.5 million per year. And as you'll see in the next couple of slides, things were pretty successful. And I think Congress saw that success. And so for 2018 and 2019, doubled the appropriation to $5 million per year. And so from fiscal year 2015 to 19, which is 5 years, we've seen a total federal investment of $17.5 million. And the non-federal match that JFNA and the partners, those of you who have received subawards, have brought to the project total over $8 million to date. And so we have a fairly significant overall investment within the past 5 years in improving and strengthening our ability to better meet the needs of Holocaust survivors, but we've also had the opportunity to test new ways for the aging network, the aging services network more broadly, to deliver services in a better way. So if we can go on to the next slide. So we've had some real milestones, and you know, I know that all of the sub-grantees who are on the call and on this webinar today, I know that you all do a lot of reporting to JFNA. And that reporting is for a reason, because JFNA has to do a lot of reporting to us. Not a lot, but they do. But I want you to know that, you know, while those reports take time and effort, they are not for naught. They do provide us with, they provide ACL, with me as the federal program officer, with some incredibly rich information for how we're making change out there. And so we've seen some incredible milestones that really have charted the success of this work, the work of all of the sub-grantees, the work of JFNA. We have seen over the course of 5 years now, 5 cohorts of sub-awardees, and you all have these great Alpha cohort, Charlie cohort, was it Delta and Echo? Yeah, I think I got them all. And Bravo, I forgot Bravo, can't do that. So we've seen 5 cohorts of sub-awardees from all over the country in many different communities, many different shapes and sizes of, you know, Holocaust survivor populations from large to small. And we've seen over 119 individual sub-grantee organizations receive funding. And with that funding, you've developed more than 200 different person-centered trauma-informed programs. And that's kind of exciting, because that's the whole idea of grants, is we want to grow, we want to change, and we want to produce the change that we want to see. And what's really exciting is that in the last 2 years of this project, we've seen an expansion of the scope of the project with that additional $2.5 million that we received for years 4 and 5 of the project. What's even more exciting is what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, and that's the numbers of people that this effort has reached, that you all have worked so hard to serve and better support. We've served over 30,000 different individuals, and that includes more than 15,500 survivors with a range of different types of trauma-informed services and supports, ranging anywhere from new and really innovative socialization programs to emergency services, to meals, to transportation, you name it. You all have done it, and you've put the trauma-informed and person-centered focus on these services in new and really creative ways. You all also demonstrated that you are able to reach and have a meaningful impact on more than 4,000 family caregivers. And I think what's really incredible is the organizational and professional changes that we've seen. Pretty early in this project, we saw the opportunity and really the desire for the sub-grantees to begin to explore not only how they develop services for Holocaust survivors, but how does the organization itself become more trauma-informed, all the way from, as we've said from in some of our conversations that we've had, from the boardroom to the break room, everybody in the organization, every aspect of the organization becomes trauma informed. And that was kind of an unexpected added sort of a component that we began to see emerging, and I'm really excited about it because I think it shows the true commitment of all of the sub-grantee organizations, but also of our grantee, the Jewish Federations, in really being able to see the potential for this program and then really running with it. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So if for any of you who have worked with a government entity, a government funding entity, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, the community level, you'll oftentimes hear outcomes, outcomes, outcomes. We, as the federal government, we want to see the bang for our buck. What is the change? How have we changed? How do we quantify the change? And it isn't the numbers of hours necessarily that are of service that are delivered, for example, although that's very important, but is what did those hours do? What change did we see for those hours of service? And I can tell you that in the evaluations that have happened on this, on the subaward projects, we have found that among the survivors that have been served, measurable reductions in anxiety, depression, and loneliness. Those are such key components of health and well-being for older adults, particularly. Oh, I think we jumped on a slide. If we can, yeah, there we go. But we're also seeing, greater connectedness to others, and we're hearing more and more about the impacts of social isolation on the lives of older adults, particularly now with this pandemic and people having to quarantine. The issues of social isolation and feeling disconnected are even more acute. And so I think we have an opportunity to really learn from the work of this project and take forward some of those interventions that have really promoted connectedness. You all have improved access to services and supports. You've also been able to document that the survivors that have been served are better able to do self-care. And isn't that kind of what we're all about, is about helping to maintain the independence and well-being of older adults? And so the fact that we can do that and demonstrate that, I think, is really significant. And then greater confidence in the ability to remain at home. That's one of the basic underpinning tenets of the Older Americans Act. And these are Older Americans Act funds, they're demonstration funds. And we're definitely being able to show that the older adults that you serve are better able and more confident in their ability to remain at home. And that's just for the people that are served. But we're also seeing some measurable improvements in the network capacity, the professionals, the organizations. We're seeing more confidence and comfort in working with Holocaust survivors. Holocaust survivors bring such a unique perspective. They bring such a unique set of needs that require a real ability to understand and connect. And I think it's exciting to see the confidence and comfort of the organizations that have been funded being able to better work with survivors. Just growth in knowledge, its professional capacity around trauma itself, being able to recognize it and then incorporate PCTI approaches. One of the things is key is about being able to, we've seen that organizations are better able to recognize and avoid triggers for re-traumatization. That's critical because oftentimes if we trigger, if a survivor experiences, or anybody with a history of trauma, is triggered and can begin to experience those events in the past, you oftentimes can set them back in their, in their overall well-being. And then there's greater confidence in developing and supporting PCTI systems. So all in all, we've gathered all of this information from the reports that you all have submitted. And I can tell you that I basically took the information on this slide and the one right before it, and that gets rolled up into an annual report to Congress. So we report on an annual basis the work of not only our formula grant programs, but also our demonstration programs. And this is one of those programs that I'm really, really pleased that we can report on the tremendous, both the outputs, the numbers of people served, as well as the outcomes, which we've seen on this page. So if we can go on to the next slide. Another thing that's been really exciting, and it just happened this year, is the reauthorization of the Older Americans Act. You may, for those of you who follow this, you know, 2016 was the last time the Older Americans Act was reauthorized, and in that reauthorization, we saw the requirement that ACL, at the time AOA, issue guidance on supporting and serving outreach and support to Holocaust survivors. And with the help of JFNA and many of you, I'm sure, on this call, we were able to develop that guidance and issue it out to the broader Aging Services Network. And that was the first time we had a real specific focus back in 2016 on the needs of Holocaust survivors. Well, since then, and now with the 2020 reauthorization, we've actually seen your work, the hard work that each one of you has done under the leadership of JFNA, codified in statute in the Older Americans Act. You know, for example, Section 102 adds as one of the key objectives of the Older Americans Act, all services, is to access to PCTI versions or versions of those services. Making sure that we're doing things in person-centered, trauma-informed ways. The Act also, in Section 112, defines person-centered and trauma-informed, which I think is really cool, because if you think, you know, this term didn't exist 5 years ago, you all started developing it and growing it, and now suddenly it's codified into statute. That's pretty significant. Section 120 also authorizes the creation of a national resource center on older individuals experiencing the long-term and adverse consequences of trauma. And I think that's directly the result of the success that you all have shown, and, you know, that we've been able to measure, to demonstrate that if you provide sound technical assistance, you create the capacity to do this work. There's also a couple of other mentions that now in Section 205 requires AAAs to include Holocaust survivors in their outreach efforts. And then in Section 207, there's a new requirement or provision around data collection and outreach for specific targeted populations. And this is going to get a little techie, but it's Title IV of the Older Americans Act is where all of our demonstration grants happen. And Section 207 talks about now projects funded under Title IV, which in fact this work is funded under, data collection for populations served by Title IV programs has to be collected. And so we're just getting into understanding how this is going to be implemented, and so it will take some time. But ACL and AOA will begin working with our network to better understand how we make this data collection and outreach to these specific and targeted populations a reality. So I point all of this out to say that, you know, when we see things developing in statute like this, this means that the work has meaning, the work is lasting, and that's kind of exciting. So go ahead and on to the next slide. So where do we go from here? Well, for those of you who've been keeping track, this is the we're in the fifth and final year of the funding of the grant that we funded in 2015. That project ends near the end of September of this year. So a couple of months ago, ACL issued a new funding opportunity announcement for FY 2020. It's for a new 5-year cooperative agreement. We have $5 million to spend per year pending the availability of federal funding. So we're good for this year. We'll see what happens in subsequent years. But our goal with this new funding opportunity is to expand person-centered trauma-informed service provision and the national technical assistance efforts that began in the under the first project. So if we can go to the next slide. So over the next 5 years, ACL anticipates, and then the 2 priority areas that we set out in this new project is to expand our work to focus on 3 populations. First and foremost will be the Holocaust survivors, but we're also looking to expand more explicitly into working with other older adults with histories of trauma, as well as family caregivers for all older adults with histories of trauma, Holocaust survivors or not. But Holocaust survivors will always remain the focus of our efforts, but we have an opportunity to begin to broaden out and begin to spread the work that you all have done and are doing and demonstrating works so well to other older adult populations who have histories of trauma. The other priority area that we're going to be focusing on with this new grant is expanding the technical assistance to include, to reach and target broader audiences across cross section of populations with trauma history. So that could be, in addition to Holocaust survivors, victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse, the Native American populations. A lot of work can happen with tribes. We know the history of trauma there. Refugees, older adult refugees who have maybe have fled you know, severe situations of genocide, what have you. We have an opportunity to work with other older adult populations with history of trauma. So the technical assistance that began in the first 5 years will continue and then grow and expand as we look to increase the national capacity to deliver trauma-informed supportive services to older adults. So we can go on to the next slide, please. So, and we're also looking into continuing to expand the focus of the service provision. We want to look at opportunities to really focus on trauma-informed supportive services in comprehensive care management and care transitions. Innovations across care settings. We know that not all care is provided in nursing homes or assisted living facilities or at the home. It's all of these settings and more. And so we want to look at how can we innovate in some of these other across care settings so that anywhere that may have an opportunity to serve an older adult with a history of trauma has that trauma-informed mindset and the ability to meet their needs. We'll hopefully be looking at developing some trauma-informed psychosocial interventions, a focus and push on trauma-informed lawyering and legal assistance. This is some work that is not only started to occur in the first grant, but we're also seeing through the work of the Elder Justice Coordinating Council a focus on trauma. A nice tie-in with some of the other work that ACL and AOA is doing around our elder justice activities. In socialization and wellness programs, caregiver support is one of the main focus areas for our new work here. Dementia care and support. And then end-of-life advanced planning and palliative care. We began to see a little bit of this work emerging in the first 5 years of this project, and there's a real promise for it. I was at one of the workshops in Columbus, Ohio, and I think this is one of the first times we began to focus very, very specifically on end-of-life and palliative care and advanced planning for Holocaust survivors. And it's a very, very sensitive issue, but there's an opportunity to really grow our ability to do this in a sensitive and effective way for not only for Holocaust survivors, but any other older adult population with histories of trauma. So we're going to see our focus expanding over the next 5 years. Hopefully those are the goals that ACL has set with this new funding opportunity. If you can go to the next slide. So really, over the next 5 years, the work that you have done over the previous 5 years, what we hope to do in the next 5 years, really, if you can just hit the return button, yeah. ACL has had a long history, AOA in particular, before we ever, oh, go back, yeah. I should have taken that animation out of there, but I didn't. This work that you all have been doing for the past 5 years fits squarely into ACL AOA's 55-year history of innovating in the field of aging. This is pretty innovative stuff. There was not a lot of work in trauma and aging prior to this. You guys are real trailblazers in this, and we're going to continue that. Part of our history in these demonstration type grants is to test new ways of meeting the needs of a growing and increasingly diverse population of older Americans. This is definitely testing new innovations, and we'll continue to do that. Paving the way for future providers of aging services to have access to knowledge and practices. This is a lot of this work is about training providers and capacity building, improving programs and services in meaningful ways, and then just strengthening the responsiveness and capacity of the Aging Services Network. Anytime we have the opportunity to strengthen the ability of our states, our area agencies on aging, and our local service providers, no matter who they are, to better meet the needs of the older adult populations that they serve, that they touch on a daily basis, I think is money well spent. As we saw, because we went too quickly, that's the end of what I had to say, but I am happy to take questions. I think somebody has been monitoring them, so I will let you all take it from there.
Sure. With that, Greg, thank you so very much. Actually, I've seen you speak probably 10 times, and this might have been my favorite presentation of yours.
Good.
So I got a lot out of it myself. And I really, I hope all of us take to heart that his great words that we're trailblazing the field of trauma and aging is really something I'm going to walk away with. And that's from the federal government that we're hearing this. You can tell how lucky we are that Greg has such a great pulse on what's going on, and it really is coming from all of the data that you all are submitting. So with that, I'd like to hand the microphone over to my colleague, Dr. Barbara Bedney, who is the Director of Evaluations and Research. And many of you know her already from working on your evaluations strategies. And if you don't know her yet, you'll know her within the next 2 weeks for sure. So with that, Dr. Bedney.
And Greg, thank you again. I agree, that was fantastic and very much appreciated.
My pleasure.
So I will do my best to go through the questions here. It looks like we have a question seeing a much higher need for PCTI support for 2G, I guess second generation, because of the isolation and inability to be present for their Holocaust survivor loved ones. So will funding for second generation be considered in the future?
So the funding opportunity announcement that that just closed recently and that we're recompeting has the focus one of the focus areas for family caregivers, which could be second generation. So we're starting to get into that with this. We saw some serving of family caregivers in this first 5-year project. We made it an explicit focus area in the second iteration of this project, which will kick off later this year. There will be that focus on the second generation or caregivers.
And can organizations such as JFNA funded organizations participate in advocacy on behalf of ACL?
You are able to advocate. You have to be, there are certain restrictions around how that advocacy can be done. You can't, and what I would encourage is that you work with JFNA, but also your own leadership to make sure that any advocacy that you do is in line with any statutory limitations. For example, you couldn't use Older Americans Act funds to advocate for Older Americans Act programs and funding. So there are very careful ways of having to do it, and it's probably beyond the scope of this conversation, but we could have an offline conversation with you guys and with JFNA about how to do that.
Okay. Along with legal and financial interventions is medical interventions, letting the medical community know about PCTI.
So that's one of the areas where I think we have an opportunity to expand into in this next, over the next 5 years. And that's why one of the focus areas you saw across settings. I think the medical care, the healthcare setting and sector is one of those areas where we have a real opportunity. And so I think it really becomes up to the new grantee that ACL will fund later this year and the sub-awardees as to how that shapes up. But that could certainly be one of the specific focus areas for some of the local service provision and training in particular. How do we train healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, get them to build an understanding of trauma in older adults and making sure that they understand its impacts and how they could better treat and intervene for their patients with histories of trauma.
And to dovetail on what Greg is saying, I want to give a shout out to our subgrantees who are already working on training our doctors and also medical professionals currently with their grant funding. We're really grateful, and I'm sure it's really helpful right now, especially in the time of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That is actually all the questions I see outside of some comments. That was a great and excellent presentation. You guys see any of these that I'm missing?
Well, I wish I was there. I wish we were all together in person because I love being able to interact with you and to talk with you. And but this will do for this year. So.
So Greg, I want to thank you for helping us see the forest between the trees as we often get into the nitty-gritty of our own work. And also, I want to give a shout out to all of our subgrantees who are really working extra hours and extra hard during these times of COVID. And as we're all many of us are working from home. So I really thank you for that. Next slide, please. So with that, you're welcome to continue sending questions to the question box, or else you can write us if you didn't want to ask questions publicly. You can write us at holocaustcenter@jewishfederations.org if you have additional questions. And we have a regular line to Greg and can get back to you with answers. We encourage you to complete the evaluation at the end of this presentation. It helps to steer our future trainings and to give us ideas on how to improve, and we take them quite seriously. Also, for those of you who are current subgrantees, to please remember to complete the to submit an attendance verification form, and the word is support. That is the code word for to prove participation in this webinar. And we will certainly send the PowerPoint and recording after this webinar. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to contact us at holocaustcenter@jewishfederations.org. Next slide, please. Any other questions before we sign off? Also wanted to give a heads up that we are in the middle of coordinating another webinar. It's going to be next month, and it's on trauma and aging in the future. And so we have Dr. Joan Cook and Dr. Ruzek, who is going to present on that webinar, and we look forward to seeing you there. And that is all for today. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And Stacy, we appreciate your time, and Greg as well, and Barbara as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.